Here is Vinta Summer Green Karnival. The color for me in Florida made me think of that late spring green. So I would say that the same here is the name here is perfect, where they're saying summer green, and I'm thinking late spring. Not a problem. This shades very nicely and does change tone as paper changes, but is always easy to read and enjoyable. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, unfortunately, it can be fairly aggressive, which severely limits the ink to me. An easy no-go for me, or what I really look at first in an ink, is how aggressive it is. I'm very unlikely to buy an ink that shows a ton of aggressiveness on paper. This did bleed frequently off camera for me, so there's no. I'm likely to never just use it again.
The pen for today is a Mont Blanc 149. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we're really seeing that lovely spring grass green that I tend to see a lot of here in Florida around spring. This doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade incredibly well. Any word you choose has shading in it. About any word, take a look at about. It doesn't have a ton. The A is lighter. The B at the bottom is just a mid-tone lightening into the O. The UT at the end, much darker. Really is giving a nice mix of the tones that this ink is capable of giving. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting, easily continuing our notes back here.
Vinta makes more than just one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Vinta.
Here is Vinta Terracotta de Milli. Here is Vinta Mascara. Here is Vinta Remblanc. Here is Vinta St. John's Laguna.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
We can see here that the color is generally lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. I say generally lighter because it does have a ton of shading that's going on, though the shading that happens on the Clairfontaine does tend to get darker. Now here we get no feathering, we get no spread, we still get that shading. Not a ton in statements, but we do go from lighter to light midtones. Theorems shows us about as dark as we can get, with the TH being as dark as we're going to get. Lightening into the E, lightening even more into the OR, starting to get a little bit darker at the E, lightening again at the M, much darker with the S at the end. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problem continuing our notes back here.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
I would have to say going into this that I really expected this toned paper to make this an even more vibrant ink, and it didn't. It really toned it down, really made it less interesting. And I don't know that it's because of the tone of the paper or because of the makeup of the paper, but it is a less interesting green here. Now, it does have tiny bits of feathering that you can see these on these, or at the end of conjectures, you see at the top of the T, the RES at the end, quite a bit of feathering happening there. Though it's not happening all over the place, it is happening there again. It does happen some. It's not the best on this paper. It doesn't have any real spread going on. It does have some shading going on, but with some of that shading tends to come some feathering. Looking at the back of the page, you see that some of the reason for that feathering is the aggressiveness of the ink. Look at how deep into the paper it's really getting. A lot of ghosting. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath, but you could not write back here.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tones as the Clairfontaine. Now, it does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, something to consider when looking at consider on the first line, where the consi is a little bit lighter, quite a bit lighter. The dir at the end darkens up quite a bit, as happens here on root, where the R is a nice mid-tone, the oo in the middle lightens just a little bit, but that T at the end, very dark. I don't think this is a particularly standout tone against the quad rule paper. I don't think if quad rule is what you prefer, that this would be a great ink, because I see them both together at the same time, and it could be just a little visually confusing for me. Looking at the back of the page, you see there's a whole bunch of spots where it was very aggressive, getting deeper into the paper, not all the way to the point of bleeding. It did not bleed through touching the page underneath. I still think you could write on the back of the page, but if this is something that would bother you, then consider it. If you didn't see all these little marks until I circled them, then keep that in mind that, you probably wouldn't have a problem here.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more green inks. Here is Califolio Teodora. Here is Diatramentis Artist Ink Green. Here is Delta Green. Here is Noodler's Bad Green Gator. All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we get a duller, flatter, less interesting version of this tone on the page. Not a fault of the ink. This paper tends to make inks flatter, makes them sometimes less interesting. It can absorb some of the qualities of an ink. It's not made for fountain pens. It just tends to be agreeable with them most of the time. Does not feather, does not spread, does have little bits of shading. You can see it in numbers here on the first line, where the B is a little bit darker than the letters around it, and the S at the end does get quite a bit darker. It doesn't have to shade all the time a ton, but on doesn't, it does shade fairly decent, starting lighter, working its way to a much darker T at the end. Some of the shading we can see makes sense. Look at make, M-A is nice and light, K-E, nice and dark. But we get statements, which is all one tone. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue writing back here.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page. Here is Sailor Gentle Apricot. Here is Ackerman, their number 14.
Here is Tasha Kuro.
Here is Birmingham Pen Company Fred Rogers Cardigan Red. The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the tone on the page, we see that it is quite a bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. Flatter, less interesting, but, it's copy paper. It does have little bits of feathering that you can see here on statements, and correct, it does have some feathering, but it's not the amount or type of feathering that would probably stop most people from using it. It is just simply there. It does have some spread, which would be expected with dealing with copy paper. It does have little bits of shading, so it's got that going for it. Looking at the back of the page, there's no real surprise with how deep into the page this got. There's no writing back here. It's extreme ghosting, but nothing bled through to the other side.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
This Mont Blanc 149 has a nice, juicy, fine nib that generally gives nice shading, but lets the ink be aggressive on the paper. Off camera, I went for a very dry stub, and the shading was better, and it did cut down on the aggressive nature here. I think you need a dry fine or a dry medium to fully enjoy this ink without worry of bleeding, because boy, can this ink be aggressive. B-E aggressive.